In 2024, a NASA aircraft flew over the Greenland Ice Sheet with a radar instrument pointed down into the white. The team expected ice layers, they expected bedrock, they expected the usual frozen history that radar pulls out of places no person can see. Then a grid appeared under the ice. Not a natural grid, not a fracture pattern. A buried Cold War base pressed into the glacier, still organized enough for radar to pick out the old geometry. That is the part of this list that matters. The strangest footage is rarely the footage that shows a monster. It is the footage that shows a shape where no shape should be, and then forces officials, scientists, or military agencies to explain why the shape was there at all. Some of these were filmed by drones, some by satellites, some by aircraft radar, lunar orbiters, and public mapping tools that were never meant to become mystery machines. But each one begins the same way. Someone looks down at an image, and the image looks back wrong. Number 10. The Gobi Desert Grids. In November 2011, people using public satellite imagery started passing around images from remote parts of western China. The place usually named in the coverage was near Dunhuang and Jiuquan in Gansu, north of the Shule River, where the dry land gives almost nothing away at ground level. From above, it did. The first images showed enormous white-lined patterns spread over the desert. Some resembled broken circuitry, some resembled targeting grids. One report described a pattern roughly a mile long and more than 3,000 feet wide. Another showed intersecting lines on a much larger scale, crossing the land in a way that looked planned, surveyed, and meant to be seen from orbit. That last part is what made the images stick. Roads usually make sense from the ground first. Farms make sense from the ground first. Mining scars have a logic you can follow when you see the pit, the tailings, the service roads.
These patterns made more sense from space.
Wired's Danger Room followed the public hunt as readers and former intelligence analyst Alan Thompson examined the sites. Thompson had spent years noticing strange things in open satellite imagery, and even he treated some of the Chinese desert finds as genuinely unclear. One theory came from Jonathan Hill, a research technician at the Mars spaceflight facility, who suggested some of the giant grids might be calibration targets for satellites. That is a sober explanation, but it does not flatten the feeling. It makes it colder. Because a satellite calibration target is still a message to a machine in orbit. It is a deliberately unnatural mark, cut into empty land, so that something above the atmosphere can look down and measure itself. How many different kinds of marks were clustered into the same public panic? One pattern looked technical, another suggested a range, another suggested writing. Some marks sat near roads and facilities. Some seemed isolated enough that a person could stare at them for a long time before deciding whether they were infrastructure, military geometry, or a prank aimed upward at the satellites themselves. That uncertainty is not a failure of research. It is part of open-source intelligence. A public viewer can see the outline. A former analyst can recognize that the outline matters. But the interior purpose remains behind a wall of distance, language, military land use, and state silence. Other sites nearby looked different. There were large characters on the ground. There were possible training ranges. There were facilities that commenters tried to identify as antenna farms, substations, mining operations, or military test areas. None of the reliable reporting proved the internet's wildest claims. No official document said China blocked reposts of a secret alien site. No source established a cover-up. But the reliable part is enough. In one of the emptiest landscapes on Earth, public satellite users found huge human marks that did not behave as normal human infrastructure behaves. They were too geometric for erosion, too isolated for ordinary roads, and too large to read comfortably from the ground. The mystery is not that nobody has an explanation. The mystery is that every sensible explanation still carries surveillance inside it. And once you accept that, number 9 becomes harder to laugh off. Number 9. the Phoenix Lights. On March 13, 1997, lights appeared over Arizona and became one of the most famous mass sightings in modern American UFO history. Reports came from a wide area, from Nevada through Phoenix toward Tucson. Witnesses described a V-shaped formation. Later that night, another set of lights appeared over the Phoenix area, hanging in a line, slowly vanishing one by one. The official and skeptical explanations focus on military aircraft and illumination flares. The second group of lights has often been attributed to Maryland Air National Guard aircraft dropping flares during a training exercise over the Barry Goldwater Range. That explanation matters. It belongs in the story. But the footage and the public reaction did something no explanation could undo. They turned a normal city sky into evidence. Arizona Governor Fife Symington held a memorable press conference in 1997, where the moment was handled partly with humor. Years later, Symington said publicly that he had seen something himself and described it as larger than any machine he knew. Axios, looking back in 2024, noted that the incident still sits inside Arizona's UFO lore because so many people remember the same night with different levels of certainty. This is where the Phoenix case gets interesting. It has an official explanation, but it also has a social afterimage. People kept looking up.
Similar lights in later years were quickly connected to flares, balloons, aircraft, or, in more recent cases, satellite trains. That does not make every witness foolish. It shows how a single recorded event can change the way an entire region watches the sky. The authorities moved in through statements, press briefings, and explanations. The military answer may cover the lights. It does not cover the scale of the memory. Stay with that distinction. A flare can explain a light. It cannot always explain why the same city keeps returning to the same shape in its mind. The official answer also has a timing problem, at least emotionally. People did not experience the event as one clean data point. They experienced it as reports moving across a region, followed by video, followed by explanations, followed by a governor's press conference, followed by years of people saying they still knew what they saw. Even if the later lights were flares, the earlier V-shaped reports kept a separate life in the public version of the case. That is why the Phoenix lights work as a list entry, instead of a claim about aliens. The verified story is about a city trying to process a sky event in public, under pressure, with military activity in the background and cameras already rolling. The Gobi grids were strange because they were built for something above us. The Phoenix lights were strange because thousands of ordinary people briefly felt that something above them was built too. Number 8. The Yamal crater that swallowed a drone signal. In 2020, a new crater appeared on the Yamal Peninsula in western Siberia. Researchers indexed it as C17. It sat in a region already known for gas emission craters, a class of holes linked to pressure, methane, permafrost, and sudden blowouts. This one had something the earlier craters often lacked. It was fresh. Scientific work published in Geosciences concluded, using satellite imagery, that the C17 crater formed sometime between May 15th and June 9th, 2020. That is a narrow window for a hole in the tundra. Before it was a crater, the ground held a perennial heaving mound. Then the mound failed. Gas pressure built inside frozen ground ice. The arch of the cavity broke and the surface opened. The first Yamal crater had become widely known in 2014 after helicopter pilots spotted a huge hole near the Bovanankovo gas field. The 2020 crater pushed the investigation further because researchers used a DJI Mavic Pro drone to fly into the opening. The paper describes the lower part of the cavity as having a black hole effect. From normal aerial height, the bottom could not be properly seen, so the drone had to descend 10 to 15 meters below the ground surface. Communication with satellites was briefly lost. Remote control deteriorated. The researchers wrote that the aircraft could have been lost. It was not. It came back with more than 80 photographs from inside the crater, enough to build a detailed 3D model of the underground cavity. The model showed not a simple pit, but a complex void with lateral hollows extending away from the visible opening.
That is the image that keeps this from becoming only a climate story. A drone drops into a new hole in Siberia, loses stable control, and photographs side chambers inside ice where methane pressure may have gathered before the explosion. The cause is not magic. The concern is worse than magic. A later geophysical research letters study, summarized by The Guardian, argued that warming can allow meltwater to reach salty cryopeg layers above methane hydrate, creating conditions that crack the ground and release methane explosively. The authorities did not need to close the zone for this to matter. The ground itself was warning people away. Researchers also noted the hazard to infrastructure. One crater lay only 3.5 kilometers from the Bovanenkovo to Ukhta high-pressure gas pipeline. Another formed near a railway. Frozen soil and ice fragments can be thrown hundreds of meters in some cases. So the official response becomes practical. Map the craters, fly drones into them, build models, watch the tundra for the next mound, because the next one does not announce itself with a countdown. And this is where the phrase, "made authorities move in," becomes literal without needing an invented closure. A fresh crater is not a viral clip you can leave alone. It is a hazard, a climate signal, and a possible warning about infrastructure built on permafrost. Once satellite imagery narrows the date and a drone shows lateral hollows inside the crater wall, the hole stops being a curiosity. It becomes a site. A site has coordinates. A site can be revisited. A site can be compared with the next one. That is what makes Yamal disturbing in a grounded way. The footage does not ask whether the crater exists. It asks how many mounds are already forming that no camera has entered yet. Number 7. The Yonaguni Monument. Off the coast of Yonaguni, Japan's westernmost inhabited island, divers found a submerged rock formation that still refuses to sit comfortably in one category. It has terraces, it has steps, it has right-looking angles, flat platforms, and walls that appear too deliberate in underwater footage. The structure became famous as the Yonaguni Monument. The strongest conventional view treats it as natural geology. The island sits in a seismically active region. The rock is sandstone and mudstone. Geologists who argue for a natural origin point to bedding planes, joints, fractures, and erosion. Those processes can make stone break in straight lines. On land, Yonaguni also has stepped coastal formations, which makes the underwater site feel less impossible. But the other view has never completely left. Marine geologist Masaki Kimura has argued that the formation shows human modification or construction. Popular writers have pushed it further, sometimes tying it to lost civilizations. Mainstream archaeologists have not accepted those claims, and Japanese cultural authorities have not treated the site as a protected ancient monument. That should weaken the mystery. Somehow, underwater, it does not. Because what the camera shows is not a theory. It shows a diver moving along massive stone plains in clear water. It shows edges that feel architectural before the brain has time to correct itself. It shows the kind of place where the natural explanation can be right and still not feel complete. The official absence matters here. There is no recognized city, no accepted ruin, no protected site, no inscription that locks the question down. There is only the formation, the footage, and the uncomfortable fact that a natural process can sometimes imitate intention better than a hoax can. This is why Yonaguni belongs above the Phoenix Lights. The sky can trick distance and scale. Stone is harder. Stone sits there. The diver can touch it. And when a staircase shape continues into the dark water, the mind does not want a lecture on bedding planes. The sea adds one more problem. On land, a disputed formation can be walked, photographed, sampled, mapped, and revisited by teams without needing dive conditions. Underwater, every observation arrives through currents, visibility, depth, camera angle, and the short time a diver can spend near the structure. That does not make the artificial theory stronger. It makes the disagreement harder to kill, because the site is always partly withheld by the water. It wants to know who cut the steps. Number 6. Lake Vostok under Antarctica. For years, one of Antarctica's largest secrets was not a base. It was a lake. Lake Vostok lies beneath roughly 4 kilometers of East Antarctic ice, near Russia's Vostok station. Radar and geophysical work confirmed that an enormous body of liquid water exists below the ice sheet, isolated from the open atmosphere for a span often described in millions of years. Wired reported in 2012 that Russian researchers finally penetrated the lake after drilling 3,768 meters. That number is almost too large to imagine properly. 3,768 meters of ice before the water begins. The drilling raised immediate scientific and environmental questions. A sealed lake is not a normal target. It is an archive and possibly an ecosystem. Researchers have long been interested in Lake Vostok because any microbial life there would have adapted to cold, darkness, pressure, and isolation. That makes the lake relevant to astrobiology, especially comparisons to ice-covered ocean worlds such as Europa or Enceladus. The problem is that touching a sealed world changes it. Drilling requires fluids, equipment, heat, pressure control, and human judgment under brutal Antarctic constraints. The Russian approach involved allowing lake water to rise and freeze in the borehole, so refrozen samples could later be recovered. Supporters saw a careful way to avoid direct contamination. Critics worried about drilling fluids and the difficulty of proving clean contact. Nothing about that feels built for online myth. It feels stranger. Because the hidden world was real, the official response had to become more cautious, not less. Scientists debated protocols. Antarctic researchers discussed cleanliness. Missions to other subglacial lakes shaped codes of conduct for drilling and sampling. At Vostok, the lake itself became a kind of boundary line, reachable by technology, but not morally simple to enter. The original rumor was a secret base in Antarctica. The verified version may be better. A base implies people hiding from other people. Lake Vostok implies the planet hiding from everyone. The station above it was real. The drilling was real. The race against Antarctic weather was real. The concerns over contamination were real. Wired reported on the final stages when the drill sat close to the lake, and the team had to balance access against the brutal schedule of the Antarctic season. That practical detail gives the story its pressure. No dramatic soundtrack is needed when winter itself can strand the operation. A secret base can be abandoned. A hidden lake under 4 kilometers of ice has been waiting since before human history had names. And when the drill finally reached it, the question was not whether authorities would move in. The question was whether they had the right to open it at all. Number 5. The ocean floor streets that were never streets. For years, people exploring online maps found grids on the ocean floor and thought they were looking at something artificial. The most famous examples appeared northwest of the Canary Islands in the Atlantic. On maps, the lines looked regular, rectangular, and urban. They resembled streets under the sea. No AA has a direct answer for this one. The lines are not physical marks on the seafloor. They are artifacts of mapping data. Ships using sonar collect higher resolution readings along their paths. Online maps stitch together surveys of different quality, and the paths of those ships can appear as gridded lines over lower resolution bathymetry. NOAA even notes that one often cited underwater city location covers an area more than 100 miles wide. That should end it, but it does not end the feeling, because the explanation reveals something almost as strange as the rumor. We have better public imagery of many city streets than we do of huge parts of the ocean bottom. Google Earth and similar tools let ordinary people descend into an incomplete world made from layers of data gathered at different resolutions by different agencies over different times. Where the layers meet badly, the human eye fills the gap with architecture. Wired covered the Atlantis panic and the later map updates that removed some of the artifacts. Columbia's global multi-resolution topography synthesis and other bathymetric work improved the view, but the correction did not make the ocean feel smaller. It made the unknown more technical. The false streets were not streets, they were ship tracks. And ship tracks mean the ocean floor was being read in strips, slowly, unevenly, by vessels dragging sound across the deep. There is something quietly worse about that. A fake city can be dismissed, a mostly unmapped abyss cannot. Number 4. Groom Lake and the place the government finally named. Area 51 does not need invented footage to feel wrong. The real documents are enough. In 2013, the National Security Archive published material from a less redacted CIA history of the U-2 and Oxcart programs. The release included numerous references to Groom Lake and Area 51, with a map of the area. The facility's role in testing secret reconnaissance aircraft moved from rumor into official historical record. That is the part many people miss. The government did not confirm aliens, it confirmed the machinery that made alien rumors believable. High-altitude aircraft, restricted airspace, black programs, desert runways, official silence. Groom Lake was selected in the 1950s for the U-2 program because secrecy mattered. Later, the Oxcart program brought the A-12, a predecessor to the SR-71. Aircraft that flew higher and faster than the public expected would naturally produce sightings. A person on the ground did not need to be irrational to misread a machine they were never allowed to know existed. The site sits inside a broader military range environment in Nevada. Public satellite imagery eventually showed runways, roads, and buildings. Civilian watchers have spent decades looking toward the restricted area from legal vantage points, listening, photographing, comparing schedules, and trying to separate aircraft from legend. The CIA history also helps explain why visual evidence around Groom Lake always feels incomplete. The aircraft programs were designed around absence from normal bases, absence from normal accounting, absence from normal public vocabulary. When a black aircraft is built to evade radar, tested in a closed desert, and hidden inside compartmented language, the first public traces almost have to register as anomalies instead of machines. That relationship is the mystery. The public stares from outside. The state answers years later, sometimes with redactions still in place. The old top list version called it anomalous activity over Area 51. The verified version is tighter. Area 51 is the place where anomalous activity became a management problem. Not because every light meant something otherworldly, but because secrecy creates its own weather. When a test aircraft moves through the sky before its existence is public, the witnesses are left with the shape and no vocabulary. That is how a base becomes a myth without ever needing a saucer. Number 3. Batagaika, the Siberian gash visible from space. The cold open came from Greenland, but this is where the ground starts to look alive. Batagaika crater in Russia's Sakha Republic is not an impact crater in the Hollywood sense. NASA Earth Observatory describes it as the biggest permafrost crater in the world, a megaslump that has grown significantly over decades as thawing permafrost collapses and erodes away. The site appears in Landsat imagery as a rough brown gash against green tundra.
NASA's 2017 article said some cliff faces were more than 85 meters tall in places, and the crater kept growing as warmer summers and shorter winters thawed the frozen mixture of soil and ice. The same piece noted that Batagaika holds clues to prehistoric life, with exposed edges that may preserve up to 200,000 years of geological and biological history. That is the part that makes it feel closer to an opened archive than a hole. Animals have emerged from the thawing ground. NASA mentioned remains connected to Pleistocene horses, steppe bison, cave lions, and wolves. Bits of wood indicated that spruce and pine forests once grew there. The crater keeps expanding into the hillside, and it pulls old landscapes back into the air. Unlike the Yamal gas craters, Batagaika did not appear overnight. It is slower and therefore more disturbing. It moves at the speed of a landscape losing its memory of being frozen. Mary Edwards, a University of Southampton professor involved in research on the site, told NASA that once a feature like this is exposed, it is hard to stop.
As material melts and falls, a larger face opens to the air. That speeds more thaw. The process feeds itself. The authorities and scientists moved in with satellite monitoring, field research, and climate concern. But no one can tape a line around a crater that is also a process. There is no single event to solve. There is a wound in permafrost, widening enough to be tracked from orbit. This is the callback to Yamal. In Yamal, pressure builds under frozen ground until the surface fails. In Batagaika, the surface fails over years, and the past comes out layer by layer. One explodes, the other exhumes. The scale matters too. A single Yamal crater can be measured as an event. Batagaika has to be read as a moving boundary. NASA's comparison images showed the crater's advance across years, using Landsat data from different dates.
That kind of evidence has no witness in the usual sense. No one has to be standing there when the wall collapses. The satellite becomes the witness, and the testimony arrives as a change in shape. Number 2. Reiner Gamma and the pale scar on the Moon. Through a small telescope, the Moon can look finished. Craters, seas, mountains, shadows. It feels mapped because people have stared at it for so long. Then there is Reiner Gamma. Reiner Gamma sits in Oceanus Procellarum, west of the crater Reiner. It is one of the best-known lunar swirls, a bright, looping pattern on the lunar surface. It can be seen from Earth with many telescopes, and it does something that confused early observers. It presents as a feature, but it does not behave as a normal hill or crater behaves. It casts no meaningful shadow because it is primarily a brightness pattern, not a raised structure. The Moon has other swirls, but Reiner Gamma is the one that looks almost drawn. It has the shape of a mark, not a landform. Modern spacecraft data connects lunar swirls with magnetic anomalies. The basic idea is that local magnetic fields may protect parts of the surface from the solar wind, allowing bright material to remain optically younger while surrounding terrain darkens. Studies of mini-magnetospheres and particle impacts show that small magnetic regions can deflect charged particles, creating patterns that match parts of the observed albedo markings. That explanation is real. It is also incomplete. The origin of the magnetism itself remains a live scientific problem. Some models connect swirls with ancient impact effects. Others examine remnant crustal magnetism, solar wind shielding, dust movement, or ancient electrical currents. NASA selected future lunar science investigations aimed at Reiner Gamma because the feature is more than pretty. It is a visible clue to something hidden in the Moon's crust. The old version of this entry described parallel scars seen by an amateur telescope. The verified version is stronger because Reiner Gamma is visible, studied, and unresolved. It does not require a shaky video. It has been photographed by orbiters. It has been mapped. Scientists can name the region, describe the magnetic anomaly, and still not fully explain why the swirl looks the way it does. There is a quiet lesson in that. Some mysteries shrink when instruments get better. Reiner Gamma did the opposite. Better instruments changed the question from, "What is that mark?" to, "What kind of magnetic history can leave that mark on a body with no present global magnetic field?" That is a deeper question, and it is why the feature keeps attracting mission proposals instead of fading into lunar trivia. The comparison to the ocean floor grids matters here. In the ocean, the false streets were artifacts of human mapping. On the Moon, Reiner Gamma looks artificial, but is not a map error. The pattern is actually there. A pale mark on a dead world, protected by an invisible field. That is why it earns number 2. Number 1. The buried city under Greenland and the crater beneath the ice. Greenland gives us 2 different kinds of hidden object. One was made by humans. One may have been made by an asteroid. Both were found because instruments looked through ice. Camp Century came first as a Cold War engineering project. Built by the United States Army under the Greenland Ice Sheet, it was presented publicly as a research station and a demonstration of ice cap construction.
Its deeper military context later became associated with Project Iceworm, a plan for missile deployment tunnels under the ice. The project never became the missile network its planners imagined, and the camp was abandoned in the 1960s as the ice proved too unstable. Then the ice kept moving.
That detail makes Camp Century feel closer to a delayed machine than a ruin. Most abandoned bases decay in air. Camp Century was abandoned inside a material that flows. Walls deform, tunnels close, snow accumulates above the debris. A site built for control became trapped in one of the least controllable substances on Earth. Decades later, scientists still had to deal with what was left behind: tunnels, debris, and environmental concerns under accumulating snow and ice. Research on Camp Century has examined how future melt might affect the buried site. More recent reporting described NASA radar imagery in 2024 that unexpectedly picked out the old base again during a Greenland flight. The instrument was looking for ice and bed conditions, but it found organized structure. A city under ice is already a strong image. A forgotten nuclear-age city under ice is stronger. But Greenland has a second hidden shape that belongs beside it. The Hiawatha impact structure lies beneath Hiawatha Glacier in northwest Greenland. Scientific work published in Science Advances described a roughly 31-kilometer-wide crater-shaped depression under the ice, identified through airborne radar data and supported by impact-related material such as shocked quartz grains and melt rock clasts in sediment draining from the structure. Later dating work placed the impact far earlier than some initial speculation in the late Paleocene, about 58 million years ago. That correction matters. The crater is not evidence for a recent human catastrophe. It does not need to be. It is a circular scar under an ice sheet, large enough that aircraft radar had to reveal it. So the number one position is not a single object 100 kilometers long. That claim does not hold. The verified version is better because it gives us two real Greenland mysteries with two different emotional weights. One was hidden by classification, one was hidden by ice. Camp Century is human secrecy becoming geology. Hiawatha is geology hiding an impact scar until human instruments became precise enough to see it. One says the ice can bury what governments build. The other says the ice can hide what the planet survived. That is why Greenland belongs at the top. It does not give one clean mystery, it gives a stack. A military plan under snow, waste questions under that, radar traces under that. Then, deeper in the same island story, a crater-shaped depression in bedrock that had to wait for airborne instruments to translate ice into form. Nothing about that feels finished. And both leave the same aftertaste as the Gobi grids, the Yamal crater, and Reiner Gamma. The surface is not the whole story. We tend to trust surfaces because they are all we can stand on. Desert, tundra, ocean, ice, moon dust. They look still from a distance, and the camera makes that stillness feel final. Then the angle changes. A satellite catches lines in a desert. A city films lights over Arizona. A drone drops into a fresh Siberian crater and loses its signal. Divers swim along stone terraces off Yonaguni. A drill reaches water under Antarctica. Noah A. explains underwater streets by admitting how patchy the deep map still is. CIA files turn a rumor into a real testing ground. Landsat watches a Siberian gash eat backward into a hillside. Lunar orbiters map a bright swirl with a magnetic shadow. NASA radar finds a buried base, while another radar campaign reveals a crater under Greenland ice. The authorities moved in because the images were not enough. They never are. The image only opens the door. What waits behind it is colder, older, and usually more real than the rumor.